From the outside, the Republic of Colombia might not seem that special, but if you look closer, it is one of the most successful states in South America. While our neighboring countries' economies are stagnant or riddled with corruption, ours is quite strong with only a single issue. That of United Fruit Company influence. Besides, despite being surrounded by dictatorships or authoritarian democracies, we are a strong democracy currently led by the popular Partido Liberal Colombiano, since they have been able to fix much of the issues inherited by the rule of the Conservative Party. And their work continues, since after the most recent Congress, where they regrouped their political strength, it was decided that the partial monopoly of the United Fruit Company would be destroyed. To simply nationalize it was however deemed too expensive and a big risk for our relations with the USA, so instead we set out to outcompete them. We started by diversifying our economy through industrialization efforts. For example, we heavily invested into a region rich in coal and iron to begin production of steel made in Colombia. Then, after encouraging farmers to plant coffee instead of the banana from the United Fruit Company, as well as securing new trade agreements, we successfully defeated the company's influence and ushered in a new era of economic prosperity. During this time, our diplomats signed a non-aggression pact with Venezuela, one that we would regret in the future. However, for now it was good knowing we had great relations with at least one non-democratic government. Because in our southwest, the Republic of Peru instigated minor border conflicts with Ecuador, which they escalated into a casus belli to fully annex the whole country. We of course uttered our disagreements, since Ecuador is just like us, a liberal nation. However, there wasn't much we could do. We tried reaching out to the United States to ask for industrial support to strengthen us before Peru maybe attacks us as well. But due to the Great Depression, we didn't receive anything. So we took matters into our own hands and created Indomil, a state-owned company who will manufacture everything regarding military. At the same time, several infrastructure projects were initiated. Our capital and much of the surrounding fertile land was connected to a port on our west coast, boosting our exports. The same was seen in our Caribbean coast, where improvements of our ports helped boost the growing industry in the region. Meanwhile, the Republic of Ecuador had been fully annexed by the warmongering Peruvians. Expressing our fear to the world, we quickly received support. The liberal Costa Rica promised to send volunteers if needed, and the Americans finally acted by guaranteeing our independence under two conditions. The first one being that we stay a liberal democracy, which we of course will do. The marching revolution that the Partido Liberal Colombiano have brought us has been a success, and they have so much more in store. The second was however harder to swallow. The Americans demanded that we invade Venezuela and annex the whole country for two reasons: to liberalize it and secure its vast oil deposits. So we had to choose between a Venezuelan ally and an American, a choice which was simple. Unfortunately, the non-aggression pact with Venezuela was still in place, so we had to wait a few months to fully dismantle it before we could start justifying. This allowed for a lot of changes in our nation that were made possible due to the looming conflict. On our political side, the Liberal Party hurried up their reforms with a substantial constitutional reform. One part of it was hiding in a law that will allow us to declare Gran Colombia, because now with the war against Venezuela, the small faction of our political class which seeks this has grown, and it has basically become a goal of our whole nation to revive Bolivar's legacy. We were of course also training up a larger army to further outnumber the enemy. Only a few days before the war was declared, the Americans expanded our agreements and a fully fledged alliance was signed into existence, the Western Hemisphere Union. In the days that followed, it was also ratified by the Republic of Cuba and Costa Rica, who both sent forces to help us out. And they arrived right in time, because only a few days later we declared war on Venezuela. With the country still as corrupt and military as disloyal, we don't expect much resistance. Our first operation was to march to Lake Maracaibo, which was quickly realized since we met little resistance, and this made the second largest city in Venezuela already encircled, together with its garrisons. However, we didn't begin by trying to bring it down. Instead, we continued eastwards until reaching Caracas, which surprisingly also was undefended. We could continue our advances in this direction, but the main and final battle was now in Maracaibo. However, with the support of our Costa Rican allies, the urban warfare was easily dealt with, and the last Venezuelan forces surrendered. So Venezuela was officially annexed into our state and the long process to liberalize and integrate its people began. However, annexing Venezuela is not enough to revive Gran Colombia. Ecuador and Panama are both needed as well. Naturally, we decided to go for the weakest first, the Panama Republic. Though we won't annex all of it, since we've made an agreement with Costa Rica to split it along the American Panama Canal. While we waited for our justification to finish, our government continued their reforms. This time it was an educational reform, improving the access to school. Luckily, it was also made far easier with the establishment of a joint research program together with our allies, which also included student exchange programs. Then we also continued expanding our military by increasing funding into Indumil, allowing them to start production of artillery, which in turn allowed us to train 2 elite mountaineer divisions who heavily rely on artillery. And so, overconfident, we declared war on Panama and called in Costa Rica. Almost immediately our allies secured the western part of the country. However, we saw massive issues crossing the Darien Gap. Our troops simply couldn't do anything against the horrible jungle conditions. And with the Americans not willing to join the war, it looked like it would take forever. Fortunately, the stalemate didn't stop our work at home. We funded more universities, further improving our R&D, and we affirmed the state role in the economy to improve production of our weapons, at the same time as we moved to early mobilization. However, we can't have a stalemate forever, so eventually our army and navy prepared a naval invasion to go around the Darien Gap. While we outnumbered them 2-1 and used our mountaineers, we didn't overcome their defenses, and after quite a long time of trying, we had to retreat home. Some hope was at least found, because during all this, the Americans had liberalized Mexico and were now promising to soon join the war to finally end it. But before it happened, Peru declared war on us, which came as such a big surprise I forgot to record the start of the war. Fortunately though, despite their empire now spanning from Ecuador to Bolivia and northern Chile, we managed to keep them out of our capital together with our allies' help. Then, once the front was stable and a huge American infantry force arrived, we utilized our mountaineers to concentrate an attack and begin the reclamation. The offensive was successful as we could encircle some troops and capture the whole coastline of Ecuador, even reaching core Peruvian territory. Surprisingly, the Peruvian army were so caught off guard by our advances, there didn't seem to be any forces defending this land. But instead of going further south towards Lima, we turned east with the ultimate goal to reach the Brazilian border. While we were on our way, the Peruvians finally showed up, but at the wrong location, allowing us to reach the border and encircle about 8 divisions, a devastating blow for the Peruvians. At the same time at home, we continued working on expanding our army, focusing mostly on growing our production, but also on developing our doctrines. But back to the conflict, we prioritized continuing our offensive instead of liquidating the encircled troops, which was quite hard since they had started defending the south. But by hugging the Brazilian border, we outflanked their defenses once again and made our way towards Lima. Unfortunately, it was defended, however at the cost of the rest of the country, so even the southern city of Arequipa was captured. But despite trying to protect Lima to the last man, with the city encircled on all sides except that of the sea, they stood no chance, and eventually the government buildings of Peru were all captured, leading to their capitulation. The peace deal was actually quite a complicated one, since we had to decide over the Peruvian Empire, the Republic of Chile, and finally Panama as well. However, we found an easy way out of it, full annexation of everything. Because with the idea of Gran Colombia having become popular with the majority of our population, the idea of a united Hispanic America stretching from Panama to Tierra del Fuego has also seen a renaissance. So now that it has become a possibility, we have seized the opportunity. However, despite this new focus, we still declared the rebirth of Gran Colombia to stoke nationalism and make integrating our northern states easier, at least after we get rid of the problems with unification. It didn't take long for us to start justifying on Argentina, whose country was still in economic ruins, and the government were having a hard time controlling anything else than Buenos Aires, as liberal anti-government forces were taking over the countryside in support of us. While we waited for our army to be ready, we continued improving its doctrine, including that of our mountaineers. We also had the time to rally our people for the new reality of war and expand the technology sharing with our allies. Then the war against Argentina arrived. With the government as already stated immobile, we quickly secured the countryside, leaving only Buenos Aires as the last stronghold. But with it being encircled and with no AI actually controlling the troops, it was easily dealt with, and we could turn to the last two nations of Paraguay and Uruguay. We started with the Paraguayan communists, who despite their expansion into Bolivia were quickly defeated as we only had to capture their capital. It seems they weren't as determined to win the war as they were when they fought against Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay, the last of which we now declared war on. It was actually quite hard to defeat them, as despite being able to break through and capture a majority of their land, they only surrendered once the largest pocket of troops yet was destroyed. Fortunately it was, and we now stood ready to declare Hispanic America united. And that we did. For the first time since the colonial days of Spain, the Hispanic people of South America stand united. Well, at least after we managed to integrate them and learn them the ways of liberalism. And this will take time, as we've only just been able to core Venezuelan states. But the story isn't over just because our goal of a Hispanic America has been achieved. No, it's time to repay the Americans for their invaluable help that they've provided us by assisting them in their first major war. A war against the Japanese Empire, which includes their puppet colonies in Indonesia and Malaysia and a Thai ally. Having put a great amount of focus on constructing a magnificent navy, our American allies were confident of a quick victory. And as a result, we didn't plan for any big attacks ourselves, mainly sending some soldiers to defend American islands, including an army to the Philippines. When we were about halfway over the ocean, the Americans declared war, which unfortunately prompted some of our troop convoys to be attacked by Japanese submarines. And with our navy incredibly weak, with the American elsewhere, we took quite a few losses before even the first battle had started. But it didn't matter that much, because we did arrive to our destination at the end. During this trip, our Costa Rican ally asked if they could join our Grand Hispanic America as a subject, which we gladly agreed to further unite the Hispanic peoples of America. The Americans had also initiated the hunt for the Japanese main fleet, which so far hadn't been found. However, naval superiority everywhere allowed us to start staging naval invasions, even though we hadn't planned any because our high command were bored and just wanted to do something. We decided to start with some unimportant islands, mainly the Moluccan Islands. This was since we knew that they would be undefended, which they indeed were, allowing us to secure our first victory. During this time, we also prepared a more major invasion, that of Borneo, since the Cuban army told us they would immediately send in their light tanks if we secured the port of Sandakan. But we didn't dare launching it before great news arrived. The Japanese navy had been spotted outside the coast of Singapore, and the Americans were quick enough to arrive to the scene and blow up a huge part of the Japanese light ships, meaning their heavy ships were now doomed to be sunk as well. So we felt safe enough to launch the invasion of Borneo, especially since we knew that there was no division defending the port. So it was soon ours, and just as promised, the Cuban tank force arrived to help us out. Almost immediately they secured the Malaysian part of the island, only being slowed down by a few weak garrisons and the harsh rainforest of inner Borneo. While they were making progress, we staged another invasion on the Sulawesi Island, an island rich in rubber. But despite this, it too was undefended, allowing us to once again achieve an easy victory. Back to Borneo, the Cuban tanks had continued showing their effectiveness, as the island was now all but ours, meaning the last part to secure Indonesia, the hardest, is left. To invade Java and Sumatra, both islands who the American Intelligence Service has concluded does have Japanese garrisons. So we have to be careful. Therefore, we staged our naval invasion on the most neglected port, and just like we had hoped, all 4 mountaineers landed without any trouble, meaning we will now be able to supply the rest of the invasion. We immediately tried to cross to East Java, as it was only defended by a single Indonesian garrison, but before we succeeded, 3 Japanese divisions showed up for our first battle. Since we had the massive penalty of having to cross a strait, we lost it. However, we had a backup plan because the Japanese shortly left after successfully defending the area. So together our mountaineers and the Cuban tanks pinned down the Indonesian garrison in the province, while 4 of our infantry divisions prepared a naval invasion to land behind them. We launched it as quick as possible, and with the Japanese not expecting a thing, the garrison was now encircled. They tried to destroy our forces first, but we were much faster, and eventually the garrison was crushed, securing our foothold on Java. With the Japanese rather unorganized, we tried to rapidly continue and we saw some success, but with enemy reinforcements arriving, we were forced to retreat back. Especially as the Japanese Air Force were making life harder for us. We would request American aid to try and combat their air superiority, but any significant help didn't seem to arrive. They had focused so much on Navy, now that the battle was won, they were clueless. Especially as tensions was growing between the president and the vice president over whose fault this was. Even Thailand noticed how American presence was missing, so we and our great Cuban ally had to fend for ourselves. Unfortunately, we have a plan to restart our offensives, a second naval invasion, this time straight to Batavia, since it seems the Japanese have left it to defend the east with all their soldiers. And this was correct, because despite some Japanese submarines stalling us, no defenses were set up and the capital of Indonesia was ours. We immediately utilized this open front to make a dash eastwards, before the eastern troops managed to reinforce. This way we arrived all the way to central Java, where 10 Japanese divisions were waiting for us. But these 10 were taken from the east, meaning Cuba could now use their tanks. Breaking through in the south and with the Japanese forces retreating north meant the whole area was open. An area which once it was captured meant all those Japanese forces in the west were encircled. And their last port in the area, Surabaya, was also surrounded on all sides but one. Unfortunately, this island allowed them to replenish their organization, making it almost impossible for us to conquer the city. Especially with two other factors against us. That of the Japanese Air Force continuing to reign supreme over the island, and their submarines who are severely hurting our supplies. It seems the Americans are even more clueless than we first thought. And these two disadvantages allowed the Japanese to start a counter-offensive to liberate their troops. This caught us so off guard we failed to pin down their advances, and as a consequence the horribly undersupplied Cuban tank force defending the northern coast suffered complete destruction. We tried a counter-attack, and while Surakarta was once again captured, we were too late to stop the Japanese withdrawal of the west, allowing them to solidify 20 divisions in the last port of Java. The following weeks, not much would happen in the war. However, at home we had started developing our own air force, as we realized the Americans couldn't be counted on. The production was made a lot easier with the fact that integration had come a long way, allowing us to use Peruvian and Argentinian factories for it. The first few fighters would arrive right in time to neutralize Japanese CAS as they tried to break out from the city. They did manage to capture 2 provinces, but these were unimportant and set themselves up for being encircled. And that was just what happened, as a counter-attack with our mountaineers allowed us to encircle and crush 4 Japanese divisions. Following this and still realizing we couldn't capture the port, we decided to continue to Sumatra. Here defenses had been set up, but utilizing our naval superiority we landed 10 divisions behind their lines, encircling the 4 garrisons. And so our conquest of Sumatra started. We have succeeded with our conquest of Sumatra, and the only resistance left in Indonesia is that in Surabaya. However, even better news have arrived. The Americans have gotten help from an advisor who is finally making them participate in the war. The most substantial thing was that Taiwan was invaded and captured, allowing them to start prepare an invasion of Okinawa, the last step before mainland Japan. This, together with the surprise invasion of the undefended South Sakhalin by Central American forces, has started to put pressure on the Japanese. So, to utilize our momentum, we tried once again to kick the Japanese out of the port. This time though, we took it a step further by naval invading the island behind it to pin down the retreating forces. But despite all this we failed, especially once the Japanese submarines arrived and wreaked havoc on our supplies. It was so bad we even had to retreat from our few provinces until we had redrawn our supply routes. At least some more good news arrived, as the Americans had now successfully landed on Okinawa and started the preparations for the last battle. These preparations took some months, enough time for us to prepare a ruse to trick the Japanese and Thai armies that the next offensive is in Malaysia. We already know that they have a bunch of troops there, so a naval invasion is impossible. Instead, we decided to use paratroopers for the first time and land in central Malaysia. As the time came, we launched it, and just like everyone could guess, it didn't amount to anything. However, the American invasion was looking good. They had managed to use their amphibious tanks to land troops in Nagasaki, securing a port on the Japanese mainland. But not for long, because Japanese reinforcements quickly arrived and immediately punched out the American forces, destroying our last hope of a complete victory. With this loss, and with it being so late that Japan and Thailand even asked us about half an hour ago if we couldn't just stop playing, we decided to call it quits. An anticlimactic ending, but at least our nation of Hispanic America had been fully cored, and together with Cuba we have had more game impact than the Americans. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video, which will hopefully be a special one.